Hello everyone, Professor Look here. So I wanted to make a second video talking about some of the reading that we had this week. So when we think about protest movements in American politics, students, as we saw from some of our readings, are oftentimes at the center of these movements. This is not an accident. It is not simply a matter of youthful idealism. Student protest has been one of the most consistent and influential forms of collective political action in U.S. history. So, understanding why students protest, what they are able to achieve, and where their limits lie in being successful helps us understand both the power and the constraints of contentious politics in American democracy today. So, one reason that student protests matter is that students occupy a unique political position. They often have maybe fewer family obligations, more flexible schedules, and concentrated physical spaces. Oftentimes, campuses. We saw big protests on college campuses where mobilization, cooperation, coordination is easier. Universities bring together large numbers of young people who are exposed to maybe new ideas, maybe political debates they didn't encounter before, social networks at a time in their lives when identities and values are still being formed. Students also tend to be less embedded in existing political and economic structures. They are less likely to have careers tied to government policy, corporate interests, or long term institutional loyalties. This relative independence lowers the personal costs of political participation and makes protests a more viable option. But opportunity alone does not explain student activism. And many students might say, well, I don't have all of those things that other students have. So though that opportunity does not explain student activism alone. Students protest because they often experience political issues directly and immediately. War, civil rights, climate change, gun violence, tuition costs, free speech. These are not just abstract policy debates for students, they shape daily life, future economic prospects, and personal safety. When political institutions appear slow, unresponsive to youth, or indifferent to the struggles of students, protests can become a way to force attention or bring attention to issues. Historically, student protests has played a significant role during moments of national crises or moments of national transformation. During the Vietnam War, college campuses became major centers of anti-war activism. We talked about Kent State in class. Student protests students protested the draft, military recruitment, and U.S. foreign policy more broadly around the world. These protests did not end the war on their own. As we talked about, it is hard to sometimes figure out success versus not being successful. But these protests helped shape public discourse, increase skepticism about U.S. involvement abroad, and create political pressure that elected officials could not ignore. Importantly, student protests during the Vietnam War or in the Vietnam era were often accused of being naive, maybe disruptive, unpatriotic. We talked about public polling after the Kent State shooting and how the general public felt about the students protesting. So these criticisms, there were criticisms against the protesters. Maze, stop that. Sorry, my dog's digging. Yet, over time, many of these concerns, the concerns they raised, became part of mainstream political debate. This pattern illustrates a key dynamic of student protests. Students are often early movers, pushing ideas into public discussion before institutions are ready to act on them. Student activism has played a role in the broader civil rights movement, which we saw from a couple of our readings. While not always at the forefront, students organized sit-ins, freedom rides, and campus-based campaigns that challenged segregation and challenged discrimination. These actions demonstrated how student protest could connect local grievances to national movements, reinforcing pressure on political institutions from multiple directions. More recently, student protest has emerged across issues such as gun violence. After the Parkland school shooting in 2018, students organized walkouts, rallies, and national demonstrations demanding a change or demanding changes to gun laws and school safety issues. As discussed in your New York Times reading, these protests were notable not only for their scale, but for how quickly they mobilized others at other schools within other states. What made these protests politically significant was not that they immediately transformed federal gun policy. Many did not. But that they reshaped the national conversation. Students reframed gun violence as a generational issue, connected personal experiences to public policy debate, and used media attention to sustain pressure. In some states and localities, this translated into concrete policy change. At the national level, the impact was more indirect, but still meaningful and sustained. This brings us to an important point about the limits of student activism. Students protesting is often very effective at shaping discourse, raising awareness, and redefining what is politically acceptable to talk about. It is less consistently effective at producing immediate, large-scale policy change, especially at the federal level. This is not because student protest is ineffective, but because policy making is slow, is fragmented, and influenced by entrenched interests. Students also face some structural constraints. Their time in school is temporary. Movements must constantly recruit new participants in order as older students graduate. Institutional memory can be fragile, and sustaining long-term pressure is difficult without broader organizational support. Additionally, student movements often lack direct access to formal decision-making power. Unlike interest groups or political parties, students rarely have institutionalized channels for influencing legislation. As a result, their influence often depends on media attention, public sympathy, and allies and alliances with other actors. This is why student protest is so often shapes how issues are talked about rather than what laws are immediately passed. But that distinction does matter. Changing discourse is not trivial. When students succeed in redefining an issue, whether war or civil rights or gun violence, they alter the political environment in which future decisions are made. So, another important feature of student protest is its symbolic power. Students are often seen as representing the future. When they mobilize collectively, it sends a signal to political elites that certain issues will not fade over time. Even when policymakers resist change, they are forced to reckon with the possibility that today's student activism will become tomorrow's voters, leaders, and professionals. At the same time, student protest is often vulnerable to dismissal. Critics may portray students as inexperienced, emotional, or simply uninformed. These criticisms serve a political purpose as well. They delegitimize protest by questioning the credibility of the protesters rather than engaging with their arguments. This tension highlights a broader truth about contentious politics. Protest movements, including student protests and student movements, rarely win simply by being morally right. They succeed when they combine moral claims with organization, strategy, and connections to broader political coalitions. When student protests link up with social movements, advocacy groups, legal challenges, or electoral strategies, its influence and their influence grows. When it remains isolated, its impact is often symbolic rather than institutional. So, what should we take away from our readings about the history of student protests as a political force? First, student protest is not just a side note in American politics. It has repeatedly shaped public debate during moments of crises and transition. Second, student activism works best as a catalyst. It accelerates conversation, challenges complacency, and creates pressure that other actors may later translate into policy or into public policy. Third, student protest does have real limits. It is not a substitute for elections or legislation or pushing to impose and raise legislation or long term organization. But it is oftentimes the spark that makes those processes politically possible. Finally, understanding student protests helps us see democracy as something more than voting every few years. This is something that will emerge and we'll talk about a lot throughout the class. It reminds us that political participation takes many forms and that even actors without formal power or formal access to power can influence the direction of political life. In that sense, student protest is not just about changing policies. It is about expanding who gets to participate in politics and how political change begins. Thank you.